coming.
Tell me about the Svensker.
Okay. It seems like there's more interest in the Kensington runestone than we realized when we asked Mike to do this. And I am sensing that there may be more than one set of perspectives on whether it's true or not. So I'm not sure where Mike is coming from on this, but I think you're going to enjoy it. Hopefully you got some coffee and donuts and you have a place to see. He's going to be using the screen, so be sure you can see the screen from wherever you're seated. I would like to let you know that the next coffee at the Princess Cafe is February 11th, and Don Kramer is going to give a talk about the Plummer Building. And I think that should be kind of interesting because they're redoing the Plummer Building. And I think there's been a lot of time and effort to make sure that they have gotten historic pictures and the history down so that as they're restoring it and changing some things, that they do it right. So I think you'll thoroughly enjoy that. And we have coming up the Yankee Colby Lecture Series, not this coming Sunday, but the next Sunday, the 25th. And I am going to be making a PowerPoint presentation on 150 years of Rochester's history. And the last count, Sherry Sweetman, who has actually done about 99.9% of the work, has about 115 slides, historic slides, pictures that we put together for that. That starts at 2:30 on Sunday the 25th. And for those of you that are Harley Flathers fans, Harley's book is out. We actually have copies of it sitting on the front table up there. But he is going to be here on Saturday the 24th from noon until 4 o'clock for a book signing. So if you would like to come talk to Harley, buy his book, have his book signed, personalized to you, we will be open free to the public that particular day. We've gotten a family that has donated money so that we can have a free open house for Harley, so there won't be any charge whether you're a member or non-member. And I believe there will be some, probably some apple cider and some cookies and stuff. So, and I don't believe there's any major football games coming on that anybody in Minnesota or Wisconsin cares about anymore. So, you know, we'll try to give you something historic to do both Saturday afternoon and Sunday afternoon, the 24th and 25th. And now I will quit talking and I will turn the mic over to Mike, and he will be telling you about his perspectives on the Kensington runestone. I give you Mike Podulke.
Hi. When I was a little boy, 6, 7 years old, early 1950 thereabouts, I read about the Vikings and discovering America and Leif Erikson, and all that was a myth back then. That was a fable that wasn't believed to be true, and now it's acknowledged to be true. Around that time, I first heard about the Kensington runestone, which has fewer credentials than the Viking settlements on the East Coast. But it's still very interesting. I've been studying this stone off and on for 50 years. I have a 2-foot-high pile of books and probably a bushel of articles and junk about it. It has been fiercely contentious, but we'll try to have, I think I have a new perspective on it that I think has not been put forth in the public press. And you'll be the first or second to hear it. You want to illuminate us, Stephanie? Okay, this is Olaf Ullman. He's a good Swedish immigrant. In 1898, he was digging out mucking out a tree on a little hill in the middle of a swamp in his farm out by Alexandria, town of Kensington, and they found his stone wrapped in the roots of a stunted dwarf tree that was at least 50 years old. And he discovered this in 1898, so it had to have been there, if you give it any truth at all, you know, before the European settlement began up there. On the stone were some little, he took it home and he cleaned it up a little bit, and they found some scratches on it, and the scratches, when they could get somebody to read them, were a very strange variety of Scandinavian runes, and the message on the stone, my wife is intelligent and beautiful and loyal, but she's dyslexic. Okay, 8 Swedes and 22 Norwegians on an exploration journey from Vinland westward. We had our camp on a rock by 2 rocky islands, 1 day's journey north of this stone. We were out fishing one day. When we came home, we found 10 men, red with blood and dead. AVM, save us from evil. I learned something last night that you can print with your computer printer on plastic. This morning I learned that it don't dry. So. We have 10 men by the sea to look after our ship's 14 days journey from this island. Okay, hypothetically, these guys came down from Hudson Bay, and there's all kind of problems about this message being real. 8 Swedes and 22 Norwegians. For most of the history of Scandinavia, Swedes and Norwegians didn't hang out together if they could avoid it. That's an odd thing. There's problems with the distance. 1 day's journey north of this stone. You couldn't go very far pulling a boat down the river. There is an island, Cormorant Lake has islands like that, about 40, 50 miles north of there, and there's a Viking motel, and they claim that they found Viking metal implements there when they ran the metal detectors over it, but nobody knows where they are. It's one of those deals. If you're going to study the stone open-mindedly, you have to allow for the possibility that a real thing fell into the hands of scoundrels, which on occasion happens. The people that have had possession of the stone, by and large, believed it was a fraud and exploited it as if it were a forgery. AVM is not typical. What is that? I'm not a Catholic. Ave Maria, Virgin Mary, save us from evil. That's Latin letters mixed in. That was not typical. We have 10 men by the sea to look after our ship's 14 days journey on foot and rowing a boat. It's a long way to Hudson Bay, more than 14 days. And that's a problem. The year is 1362. All sorts of complications. The stone of the rune form, they switch to the next slide now. Of the rune forms used on the stone, there's 23 different runes or letters used on the stone. About half of them, oh, this is just a, okay. The runic language is very complex and has changed a lot. It changed rapidly over history. It went from a 16-letter form to a 20-letter form. Go on to the next one. It's by no means a stable tool. Here's the message, and if you read close, you can see the words above the runes. About half of the runes had never been seen before in a document of that age. They appeared to be newer, and several of the runic forms had never been seen anywhere except on this stone. No one had ever seen that age using the decimal date in runes or the decimal date in Scandinavia at all. The AVM, Ave Maria, with Latin letters mixed in with runes is atypical as well. There are many reasons to be suspicious of it. One wonders how they could read it if half the runes were inappropriate, but they did read it, and it did say that. They said it was a fraud, so Olaf took it back home and used it for a step in his cow yard, and the cows walked over it to get up into the barn for many years. Some people say that was its best estimate.
I have a question though.
Yeah.
Why, if he really believed it was real, why would he do that? Why wouldn't you put it in your basement or something?
He didn't know.
But he found it,
He found it.
and it was under a tree, so he knew it was real. Why would he let cows walk on it? That just bothers me a little bit. I would like to believe it's real, but...
Yeah. Even if he believed it was a fraud, why would you let cows walk on it if you thought it had a future? One of the curious things, the word opduggle stuff roughly translates to discovery, a journey. It's a rarely seen word in runes, and it has led to a lot of, this was too high step? What? Oh, the map. Okay. That was one of the complicated words. It means, it says on the stone that they're on a journey of discovery from Vinland out to discover the West. Next.
How did they get to Alexandria? It's a little
Well,
ways from the Red River.
We'll get to that. If you can you read that top line, Stephanie? It got to be so complex that with the people who study runes are serious things. And it says the phoneme theta realized as the third fricative spirit, theta in initial position is the source fricative spirit in medial and final positions is represented by the graphome by 1400. To initial position begin to shift the fricative while medial and final either, you get the point that it's a very scholarly and scientific study. And the other thing that you need to know is that the runes that the scholars had to study were largely the accounting, the business runes that were written by the Hanseatic League in the big cities, and they were not the runes of the countryside, which there are scarce. Next. Oh, these are the 14, never mind, just pass on that. Those are the 14 difficult runes that nobody knows about, and I don't either. Okay, to back up from here, the Vikings, history is like politics. If you let your opponents define you, you're in big trouble. And the Vikings, unfortunately for them, didn't do a lot of writing. And so their enemies did the writing, wrote the books, and defined who the Vikings were. And we know all about the Viking raiders and the Viking ships and all their coastal raids and their warlike things and all the places they went by sea. What we don't know about very well at all, it's hard to find out about it, was the Vikings in Russia. Rus is a word derived from red, meaning Vikings. The Vikings conquered Russia early on, and carry on to the next. And they had a very successful trading empire. Well, these are Viking land invasions, which you hear about them as raiders traveling by sea and hit and run and dragging the booty home. But these are land invasions that Viking armies. You notice on the right-hand side, the arrow that goes down from Novgorod, Pskov, Gerdogov, Chernigov, Kiev, Constantinople on the Black, and Odessa on the Black Sea. What? Oh, that's where they gave me this little pointer. You didn't give me an operating manual. Okay, this is what we're going to talk about now is this trade route. The Vikings had a presence in the 7th and 8th century. They established a military presence from over here, through the Baltic, down along the Dnieper River, through Kiev, down the other river. What they did is the same as the French did in America. They went up the river to the Altai Hills, which are not listed on the map, portaged over some swampy ground, and then down the river to Odessa. There's Odessa, the Crimean Peninsula there, to Odessa on the Black Sea, and thence to Constantinople. The next slide. The way they did this was a curious thing. At first they did it by military might, and they eventually developed, after they were Christianized, a system of fortified monasteries, which is this is an old woodcut showing the fortified monastery up in the upper corner. It's a curious concept, but that's the way they did it. And they had a regular, regulated trade route, a heavy-duty cargo carrying portaging up and down to the Middle East through the Dnieper River and Ukraine and down to the Black Sea. It was the main source of their economic power for a long time. The raiding was sort of like dessert, but their main business of the nation was was this trading. The difference between a trader and a raider is if you show up in a ship and they're weak, you're a raider. If you show up in a ship and they're strong, you become a trader. And that's the way it worked in those days. Okay, Steph. Those are ostrogs, if you ever hear the term. The fortified monasteries. It's a unique concept. It's only in that area that I've ever heard of them, ostrogs. That's the same one?
What year?
The ostrog developed after the year 1000. The Viking presence was strong down to the Black Sea as early as 600, 700, 800. Here you can see their portage routes. There's the Black Sea. They come up any one of several rivers into this marshy area, the Altai Hills, intricate portage networks, and then down the Dnieper to Odessa on the Black Sea. Okay. The route was so organized that there were rules that when you came to portages, who had the right-of-way. It was sufficiently administrated that if your boat sank and you stacked your goods on the shore, you were forbidden to plunder those goods on pain of death because the merchant had a right to them. It's a very civilized and unusual concept in those times that you could pile your goods on the shore and then walk to town to get another boat. But people were supposed to leave them alone. Usually when the ship went down, it was free for all for the stuff. Okay, at the same time as in the year 1000 and 1100, the Vikings settled, and we've heard these stories. First, Eric the Red and Leif Erikson and all that. Eric the Red had trouble with his temper and he drank. He got in trouble in Norway, so he settled Iceland, and then he got in trouble there too, so he came out. They established 2 settlements in Greenland in about 1100, it's not clear exactly when they started, the 10th, 11th century. And there are 2 settlement areas. In the western, they call this one the eastern, although on the map it's more likely the southern area. And these endured up till 1410 as the last recorded historical moment of those Viking settlements on Greenland. You have to understand here that this is Baffin Island, which I'll talk about a little more later. But Vinland is just off the map here. Because you know the Vikings up in Nova Scotia, where Leolk's meadows are, is Vinland and Markland. They're both, Markland and Vinland are right about there. It's hard, you can't find a map with a Viking perspective. You just can't. I spent hours on the internet looking for maps, and nobody has a map with Greenland or Baffin Bay as the center. And that's very big. They just don't do it. It's even hard to find a map of the trade route that I showed you just a little while ago. Okay. The Vikings, they established these settlements in Greenland during a warm period, and they fell on hard times. The economic importance of was undermined by the Hanseatic League, which grew up in the Baltic in the areas, the Scandinavian and Germany, Estonia, Latvia area. It was a merchant league. It was the first time business ruled the world. And the Germans began to dominate the league so much that the Swedes there were things like laws in Sweden that a city council had to be at least 50% Swedes for fear that the Germans would take over the city councils and run the country. And I heard from a Finnish friend of mine completely independent from this context, a cute little story which shows, and I'll tell you the story. When a Finnish grandmother takes a little boy out in the woods to pee, and he starts to pee, she says, "Shh, not so loud, or the Germans will hear and come and build a mill." which is an old Finnish joke, but it means that there is a genuine fear that the Germans would come and exploit any resource that they could find. Any falling water was subject. And that story persisted, and I heard it through the popular culture, not through history, that it came through the social branch. And that this guy, who was my age, had heard this story from his grandma as a folk story. And so that has at least lasted 500 years as a tale. Okay. In typical European fashion, the Greenlanders destroyed the environment. They overfarmed it, had erosion, ground cover. The climate changed on them too. They just really came on hard times. And it was just going down, down. In the beginning, the Greenlander houses were bigger and and later they just got small little rooms in which they lived with the cattle for warmth. There's an Inuit story. Nobody's sure exactly what happened to the Greenland Vikings. This guy, Niels Enga, a Dane who grew up in Greenland during the 18th century. Okay, this is in the 1700s. That's closer to these times. He wrote down some Inuit stories about Europeans that raided the settlements. They came to plunder. They called them Norwegians. The Norsemen were killed. The next year they came back and did it worse. And it says here, the survivors put out in their vessels loaded with what was left and sailed away south, leaving some people behind. Next year the pirates came back, and that was pretty much the end of it. The people that were left ran off with the Inuit, the Eskimos, and carry on next. And there's another Eskimo story about a people who were half foreign, the Inuit called them Tuktil, who hung around those ruins. People were in large stature, few in number, and were stupid, didn't know how to build a boat unless they stole one. Which it sounds like a bunch of leftover Europeans trying to make it in Eskimo territory. That was another thing. In typical European fashion, the Vikings did not adapt the Inuit ways. They didn't make Inuit-style boats. They didn't adapt the Inuit-style diet. In 1540, they found who was a party of Icelandic seafarers blowing off course. They found a guy lying face down on the beach, just dead. He may have been there a long time, because things don't decay very much there. It doesn't warm up. Historical records by the times of the stone, no ships are believed to have been in the land for 80 years. And the Black Death of political conditions got worse in Europe, and by 1348, plagues and famines, contact was lost with the Greenland colonies. And there's other voyagers that stopped and found nobody there. A rare window happened. It says here, the inhabitants of Greenland fell voluntarily away from the true faith Christian religion, and giving up the good manners and virtues, turned to the people of America. And some say that Greenland lies away near the western lands of the world. This is a quote from an old book. It's not completely clear, but it sounds like the Greenlanders gave up Christianity, adapted to pagan religion, and had something to do with the Americans. The Knutson expedition is a vital thing. There was a brief period of time for the reign of one man. King Magnus was king of Sweden and Norway. That only happened in the history of Scandinavia, this one occasion. A devout religious Christian king of Norway. And Magnus spent a lot of energy reinforcing and reconquering the trade routes through Ukraine and down to the Black Sea. Since the last time we were there in the 11 and 1200s, the Genghis Khan and his crew had come through, and the Crimean Tatars became established, and the Vikings were losing their control of the trade route down to Odessa and the Black Sea. King Magnus spent a lot of energy gaining back some of that ability. And the Pope rewarded him with some money to further the faith. There's a very curious worded thing. Okay. And it says here, I'm sorry to read this to you. They went on a trading on a vessel, and they came, here's the important part. They sent out the Knudsen expedition, returned to England and Norway in 1363 or 64. It was a priest from Greenland with the Investo Fortunato, a book, which this expedition brought back and gave one copy to the King of England and one copy to the King of Sweden, because Magnus was gone by then. And it's, you people that love conspiracy theories wonder why they stopped in England and gave them a copy, but that's a whole other story. Anyway, this is a rare window of opportunity at this time, and this is the text of the order. When you read this, what it says, you are to take all men who shall go into Norway, whether they are named or not named, from my bodyguard, other men's attendants, or other men as you may induce to go with you. What this says is that this was the Mars program of Scandinavia. This was the Apollo mission. This wasn't just some guys getting together to go on a lark. This was at the full weight and force of the nation, and they were setting out to search and find out what happened to Greenland, among other things. At this time, in the 1350s, the ability to raid and trade in the Atlantic was being diminished because the other European countries were growing stronger. The Crimean Tatars were taking over the other route. Scandinavia was becoming an economic backwater, sort of where they are today. And they had a motivation to reach out and find a new economic opportunity. Oh, this is another story. Just throw that out. It's a speculation that Paul Knudsen was chasing pagan Vikings, and he may have been. Okay, this is the, how do we say this? This is Greenland. These are the two settlement areas. If you go, and right down here is Vinland and Markland. It's a hard thing to imagine that these people lived here for 300 or 400 years and didn't make it over to Baffin Island and come down into the Hudson Bay. There's an interesting thing, as we've all heard of Mercator. Mercator references that that document that they gave the kings of Sweden and England, and he put in his map, he put Baffin Island with an accurate, fairly accurate description of the northern shore of Baffin Island, which is very unusually constructed, it has an odd topography. And there is no record of any other European expedition that went to that place before the time of Mercator, other than this Knudsen expedition. And Mercator actually said that he got some of his information from this document, this Fortunato. So it sort of establishes the existence of the Fortunato, even though it's lost, and it establishes that Knudsen expedition explored at least, for sure, the northern shore of Baffin Island. And it becomes speculative then, but it becomes a greater possibility that they would have come farther. They were gone for 8 years. They came back in 1364. Whoops. Oh, try it. Throw it up there anyway. Yeah, that's clear as mud. That's another one. This is a hypothetical route. This shows Hudson Bay, Lake Winnipeg, the Red River to the north, and if you turn left and go up here, is Kensington is right there. Minnesota, and not everyone knows it, is in a rare place. We're in a triple continental divide. In Minnesota, the water in the north, or the water in the west flows west and north up to Hudson Bay. In the northeast, it flows out to St. Lawrence. And in the south, it flows down to Mississippi. We're in a rare place in the world. It's a triple continental divide when the water can go that three complete directions. Is that next one already?
Yeah.
Okay, put that one. Oh, put the okay, just leave it there a second. I'll chatter. There's the tricky bit. You always get confused at the tricky bit. Given that the Inuit stories of the Vikings sailing away, there's another nobody knows where they went. There's an intriguing thing that happened in, this is the explorations of La Vendée, a Frenchman, 1732, 1739, who went out to the Dakotas and Montana way before Lewis and Clark. And he found, next slide, this just shows his travels. The next slide might be more useful. And they found, nope, keep going to the next one. Oh, is there a map?
Yeah.
Show the map. Okay. And they found a stone in about that area of South Dakota. You know, this is the Red River coming down. The Kensington is up here. Okay, the Triple Continental Divide is up here. It makes sense if these Vikings were looking for new economic opportunity that they would try the tried and true up the river, down the river trick, and go up major rivers and portage over through swampy areas and try to go down the other side to establish trade routes. That's what the French did. In this country, we don't have a lot of experience with the river trade routes. The Mississippi is one by itself. The Erie Canal was built to expedite a river system. The French exploited the river systems. The railroad came to this continent too quickly to fully utilize the river systems. In Europe, there are extensive river and portage systems. You can go from Europe to the Pacific. You could in the 1700s by portages and river routes. It was extensively used for trade.
So you're saying like this Knutson expedition went to look for the Greenlanders, didn't find them, and then kept going.
Their avowed mission was to look for the Greenlanders, but they couldn't have expected to find them up in the North Shore of Baffin Island. They were actually exploring, and they explored the North Shore of Baffin Island. There is what's reputed to be a Viking grave in southern Canada, north of Lake Superior, that's not well established at all and highly contentious, so we won't even talk about it. But it's reasonable to think that they would have done something like this, trying to find a new river route. They were only a few miles from where the switches over, and they could have gone down to Mississippi, gone the other way. They were a little bit off track when they put the stone up. But here was another stone here. The Frenchmen found it. They dragged it back to France and it disappeared. They said it was engraved with curious markings. They thought it to be a Tatar script, which if you look at the ancient alphabets are virtually indistinguishable from runes. It was a lot like a runic stone, if not a runic stone. There's reason to suspect it could have been a runic stone, but it's gone in mists of history. And right here, where the stone was, curiously enough, are the Mandan Indians, which you may have heard something of the Mandan Indians. Go back to that previous one where the text is. They were described as being half white, half Christian. They had the ideas of the deluge, they knew about Moses, they had a Christ figure. There's just all kinds of social and cultural things that are very interesting. They had the concept of Noah's Ark, and they had an ark myth. What else? Their early ancestor, a white man who came in a big canoe. They're different from all the other Plains Indians in appearance and in nature. They lived by the river and grew corn and traded, and all the other Plains Indians around them rode horses and chased buffalo. It was a different lifestyle. In 1832, famous painter George Catlin lived there, and he painted Mandans blonde hair and blue eyes. They found a boat, 25-foot wooden boat, with curious symbols carved on the stern post in 1860, but none of it's preserved, of course. But it is intriguing. Okay, carry on here. I don't know how we're doing here. People are starting to go to sleep on me. Okay. Yeah, this is Mercator and the map, and it said eight people came back from the Kensington expedition. These were arguably the ones left by the sea, as the people that came down to the Red River were lost and never did get back. That shows why there's no record of any of this stuff went back to Europe. It's a curious thing. There were initially the problems with the stone. It's just open to speculation yet. This expedition did happen. They were gone 8 years. They came back with a book to show the northern part of Baffin Island. It's just odd to think that they'd run around up in the ice floes of Baffin Island and not try farther south to see what they could find. We have these blue-eyed, pale-skinned, blonde Indians, the Mandans, which were curiously just virtually eradicated by smallpox. Lavendere's party wiped out half of them, and when Lewis and Clark went through, it just about destroyed the rest of them. Now there's only a couple hundred true Mandan left. They were very vulnerable to smallpox. It is being genetically different from their surrounding Indians, which suffered from smallpox, but not to the extent the Mandan did. Okay. There were several, I think that's the end of the pictures. There were several problems with the, Olaf Ullman was accused of being a joker, and there's a lot of speculation that a friend of his, a drunk, sometimes school teacher, had composed it as a joke. The problem with that problem is that, and it said that the early debunkers said that those people knew runes, but those people didn't know the odd runes. Nobody in the world knew those runes, the 13 ones that hadn't been seen before. Nobody in the world knew those runes at that time. It's unrealistic that the drunken school teacher knew those runes and didn't tell anybody. Subsequently, those runes have been found. All of the problems with the runes are largely resolved. There's a little island called Gotland, halfway between Sweden and Ukraine area. And all of those early rune forms are used pre-1360 on Gotland. And if you had someone from Gotland on the crew writing the stone, it would account for all of those discrepancies. There was modern metal found in the in the scraping, in the grooves. The farmer's, Olaf's son, said he cleaned the grooves with the nails so he could read them, which accounts for that. Modern electron scanning microscopes show that the grooves, while have been scratched with a modern metal tool, there are parts of the groove that are older, much older. There are parts of the groove that show weathering appropriate to have been scratched 100 years ago, and parts of the grooves are older, have more weathering on them. The weathering and scientific tests seem to support a greater age than 1898 for this. The stone at this time is in Sweden, getting the blessing of the runologists. And my prediction is that this is, I think it's a courtesy. This spring and summer, I predict it will get blessed and accepted as a real thing and be published. The use of AVM and the Latin letters mixed with the runes and the decimal date system have subsequently been found to have been used with runes. And the problem is that the Kensington expedition was the best and the brightest of Scandinavia. There were people who had traveled, they were cutting edge people. They weren't the scribes of the Hanseatic League sitting in their offices writing runes like they had always written them. And it's the Hanseatic runes, which are the bulk of the runes that the scholars have available to study. To me, it's completely reasonable that these people who had sailed to the Middle East and been around would have experience with the decimal system, and they were Christianized, and they would have almost certainly would have had a priest along if they were going to chase lapsed Greenlanders. And the concept of Ave Maria in Latin letters is not impossible. All those things sort of go away. The other problems, the distance problems are odd. There's an old sailor's term of that era called a day's journey, which is roughly 150 miles, which makes better sense, a day's sailing rather than a day's journey. If you translate that rune to say a day's sailing distance rather than a day's walking, it makes better sense as being able to get to Hudson Bay in 14 days. There are other examples of sailors using the sailing term day's sailing for land. You got to slide it over a little.
Yeah, now it might make more sense what it says on the stone.
What it looks like happened, what I've come to believe, I don't believe anything rock solid, but I'm strongly suspicious that this expedition did leave 10 men by the ships, by the sea, to look after the ships, 8 of which got back to Sweden and gave them the book. And that they either came in contact with the Vikings were notoriously hard on Indians when they met them in the Atlantic side. They killed a bunch first. They didn't come with an open hand, and the Indians really rose up and fought with them in the Atlantic area. That's kind of recorded. It's easy to speculate that this is the same thing, that they had irritated some Indians one way or another who attacked them. There's another theory that the pagan Vikings from the Mandan land came and fought them. That's pretty outlandish.
Did they call Rune Squealers?
In the Atlantic they did, yes. They probably called them that here too, yeah. They didn't call them anything here, it's not recorded what they called them.
Now, when they went to Hudson Bay, did they use the traditional Viking boats where they used oars and everything?
Yeah, they would have used their Viking longships up to the edge of Hudson Bay and then taken, or maybe up the Nelson River and to Lake Winnipeg, and then used smaller boats. The Viking portages were different from French portages and Indian portages in that Indians and the French unloaded their canoes, carried the luggage, reloaded. The Viking portages, they used boats with keels. They had a softer, muddier ground where they were familiar with their portaging in Ukraine. And they hauled them, the whole loaded boat across on the keel with rollers if they had to, but or just hauled it in a keel trough. So it was they portaged a different way. But that, they were very familiar with the portage concept. They were very familiar with the up the river, down the river concept.
That's pretty fast, 14 days, we could be several hundred miles.
Well, but that's the point, that you have to give them the leeway to suggest that they may have been using the day's journey concept, which was more like 150 miles of a day's sail from the sailors' jargon. They were more than likely sailors, accustomed to sailing and sailing ways. The guy from the Isle of Gotland certainly was probably a sailor to get on the crew. When you look at the crew, they undoubtedly they would have brought tradesmen, priests, or more than one, mostly sailors, sturdy people, educated people, people to make maps.
No, what I'm more curious about is their motivation to do all this. They were trading over a long, landmass,
Yeah.
and to come all this way to America. What do you know what they were after? I mean, other than plundering, they were trading.
Yeah.
What sort of things were they trading? It couldn't have been lutefisk.
I think their trade in the European trade was largely furs for the treasure of the Middle East. What went south was largely furs, things like, and what they brought back was whatever the Middle East had to offer. I think the reason that they were on this journey of looking for a new trading place was they were being frozen out of their old trading routes. The Tatars were taking over the portage route, and the Western European countries were becoming strong enough that they couldn't just sail up and down and have their way with them anymore. I think they were, and the Hanseatic League was taken over by the Germans. I think they were being frozen out economically, and they were looking for a new way to make some money, a new opportunity.
Do you think that the people who came from the Nordic countries actually got down to Minnesota in their travels, or what do the people that we know that we think of as being the first ones to come from Europe, did they come by some other route than the way that the early Vikings were coming?
Yeah, there's an interesting question of what happened to those people who left Greenland. There's no record they ever showed up back in Europe or Iceland. They could have been lost at sea. I personally suspect that they turned into the Mandan Indians. I have no evidence of that other than convenience. And just what would you do when you were getting frozen out by climate? You would head south and look for new lands. Europe was a filled-up country. There were no opportunities. I forgot to mention that in Greenland, the church had come to own virtually all the land as payment of indulgences and prayers for the dead and other complications. That most of the land was owned by the church, and the people were working as tenant farmers for the church. There were no opportunities to be an independent farmer in Europe. There weren't on Greenland either. People have a lust for land. We're all here because our ancestors were looking for a little patch of ground. And it seems reasonable that these folks would have either come down the Atlantic side or down the Hudson Bay side to head south to look for someplace warmer and look for some land. That's what I would have done.
If they became the Mandan Indians, can't DNA prove that in today's world?
It's kind of late for that. There are two problems. They're mostly all dead, and there's only a couple hundred who claim to be full-blooded Mandan left, and they're highly interbred with Europeans anyway.
Or you can at least get some hint.
Well,
Wouldn't there be some possible tie? Has anybody done any of that?
if I had the funds, I would make the test, but nobody's been motivated to do it. I think it would be inconclusive if you did do it, but, I wish somebody did, yeah. There might be some old Mandan samples of somewhere, scalps or something in a museum somewhere I'd love to test, but I can't fund it, huh?
Many years ago, the French, fur traders, they went way out west,
Yeah.
before 1800, so it's possible maybe they mixed in with the Mandan Indians.
Right, but my point was that Lavendure was the first Frenchman that got there. He was the first Frenchman that got there, and he found the blonde, blue-eyed Indians in 1740.
But there might have been some other, these fur traders, they didn't keep a record, so there's
But they didn't start trading furs till later. Lavendure's journeys were before the fur trading began.
I understand now.
Mike, this has dashed my hopes that the rune stone that I saw at Alexandria was not the genuine article.
You don't think it is?
No,
Oh, well, it could be.
you made the statement that the rune stone, unless there's lots of them.
No, how did I do that? There's, the one in Alexandria is marketed as if it were a fraud, but it appears to be genuine. But the most recent scientific tests are compatible with it being genuine more than with it being a fraud.
Well, I know so little about it, I just have to go by what I hear.
Well,
And it's your talk is very interesting.
thank you.
Thank you.
It seems that the motivation for these people to leave was the Scandinavian countries are very small, and you were indicating that the climate became colder over time,
Yeah.
is that what you're saying? And I believe that.
Yeah.
But these countries became very crowded, and these people, if the culture was at that time like we hear about it, like the older son got whatever piece of little land there was, where these people wanted to go somewhere to do something, and then when they found it, they kicked him out and went somewhere else. It seems very logical in what their motivation was.
It is their motivation would have been the same as our immediate ancestors was to come to Minnesota. The Vikings have a northern point of view. We have a Eurocentric East Coast point of view. Our people came across overland from the east. The Vikings would have come from the north. They were a northern people.
And they traveled quite fast. We were in St. Paul last year at the History Center. They had a display on the Viking relics, and they said that the boats could go to Iceland from Norway in about 2 or 3 days. They rolled and they sailed.
The Viking ships were extraordinarily well adapted to ocean voyaging. They were thin and flexible, and they rode the waves much better than any other European ships of their day. Their sails were inferior. They had a simpler rigging and couldn't sail close to the wind, whatever, if a sailor knows what that means. But their hulls were superior, and their rowing was superior.
Did you know that there is a ruin stone on the border of Oklahoma, Arkansas?
Yeah, there are numerous rune stones. There's an Oklahoma rune stone. There's numerous ones out east. I don't know about the Oklahoma stone.
They've made that into a state park down
Yeah,
there.
it doesn't have the appeal of logic and opportunity that the Kensington one does.
And then they found 3 smaller ones. They figured it was marking the farmers'
Yeah.
land. And
The-
they're in museums.
The Oklahoma stone says something more simple. I don't remember the exact words, but it was something more like, "My name is Fred and I was here." or it's a more humble inscription, yeah. Well, but I'm joking about it, but it was a humble inscription and not something that a great expedition would have put up. It seems more reasonable that those are done by volunteer immigrants who knew something of runes. And those are shorter stones, and the Kensington stone is pretty short. There's not a lot of text to analyze, but there's more. You can get into rune forms and things. I have a harder time accepting the Oklahoma stones as being real than I do. I mean, real. I mean, they're real. Somebody made them. The Kensington one, I strongly suspect, is as it says it is. It was done by the Knudsen expedition.
If it was a farmer just marking his land, he wouldn't be very extensive.
Right.
And that's kind of what they think it is.
Right.
Yeah.
Mike, is there any proof that the Viking helmets had horns?
It's almost universally accepted they did not. There's nothing worse than putting a lever on your head if you're in battle for somebody to hit and spin your head around. If somebody whacked one of those horns, it'd turn your head around real fast. I think that's a myth.
Yeah, Hollywood started that in the 1930s.
Thank you. Yeah, it's time to go. I'll say either out.
Mike, thank you. I hope you enjoyed this. I hesitate to tell you we're out of coffee, but for the first time ever, we went through the entire pot. There are about 6 donuts left, so I'm just going to leave it up to you as to see whether the survival of the fittest is true or not. I want to thank you for coming. Again, I would like to remind you that February 11th out here, we will be doing another Princess Cafe, and Dr. Kramer's going to talk about the history of the Plummer Building. Harley Flathers is here in his chariot. He will be out here the 24th doing his book signing, and I will be making a presentation down at the library at 2:30, January 25th, on 150 years of Rochester's history. So I thank you all for coming. Be careful going out. I don't know whether it's gotten colder, but it was a little slick in spots, so be careful as you leave.
I found out, I had a close call, the car starts swerving to one side of the road, and a mile down the road.
So it sounds like go slowly when you go home. Thank you for coming. Keep us in mind. Take care.
Why?